Hey everyone, tonight we're stepping into the boots of the Roman legionary, the soldiers who built an empire that stretched from Britain to the deserts of North Africa, from Spain to the banks of the Euphrates. These men are often romanticised in films and books as invincible warriors marching in perfect formation, but the reality of their daily lives was far more challenging than most people realise. Before we begin this journey through the surprisingly difficult world of Roman military service, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if historical explorations like this one speak to the imagination. Feel free to drop a comment about where in the world everyone is tuning in from tonight. It's always wonderful to see this community span continents and time zones. Now, settle in comfortably, perhaps dim those lights, and let's explore together the demanding, exhausting, and often overwhelming reality of what it truly meant to serve in history's most famous military machine. When people think of the Roman legions, they often imagine disciplined soldiers in gleaming armour, marching in perfect unison behind eagle standards, conquering territory after territory with seeming ease. The image is one of glory, honour and military excellence. The reality, however, was far more complex and considerably less glamorous. Roman legionaries faced challenges that would test even the most determined individuals: gruelling physical demands, harsh living conditions, separation from loved ones, constant danger, and a lifestyle that required surrendering nearly all personal freedom for decades. Understanding the Roman military experience requires looking beyond the triumphant victory monuments and heroic statues that the Romans themselves erected. These public celebrations of military success tell only part of the story, the part that emperors and generals wanted citizens to remember. The daily experience of ordinary soldiers, the men whose sweat and endurance actually built the empire, involved hardships that would seem almost unimaginable to modern military personnel. The Roman army's legendary success came at an enormous cost paid primarily by individual soldiers. The training was relentless, the discipline severe, the living conditions often miserable, and the commitment required was measured not in years but in decades. Young men who joined the legions as teenagers might not return to civilian life until they were middle-aged, assuming they survived at all. Their service shaped every aspect of their lives, demanding sacrifices that touched everything from personal relationships to physical health to psychological well-being. The first challenge facing potential Roman soldiers was the enormity of the commitment itself. Unlike modern militaries where enlistment might last a few years, Roman military service required an oath that bound men for extraordinary lengths of time. During the height of the empire, from roughly the 1st century BCE through the 2nd century CE, legionaries committed to serving for 20 to 25 years. This wasn't a casual decision, it was a life-altering choice that would define the next 2 or 3 decades. 25 years is difficult to comprehend in practical terms. A young man enlisting at age 18 or 20 wouldn't complete his service until his early to mid-40s. This covered the prime years of life, the period when civilians would be establishing careers, building families, and creating their place in society. Soldiers gave up all of this, surrendering their youth and much of their adulthood to military service. The commitment began with the sacramentum, the military oath. This wasn't a simple promise. It was a sacred vow that bound the soldier legally, morally, and religiously. The oath pledged absolute obedience to commanders and the emperor, promising to follow orders without question, to face any danger without hesitation, and to place military duty above all personal considerations, including family, comfort, and even personal safety. Breaking this oath was considered one of the most serious transgressions imaginable. A soldier who deserted or refused orders didn't simply face military punishment. He violated a sacred commitment that had religious implications. Roman soldiers believed that the gods themselves witnessed and enforced the military oath, meaning that breaking it invited divine punishment in addition to earthly consequences. The length of service meant that soldiers essentially grew up within the military system. Men who enlisted as young adults knew nothing but military life by the time they completed their service. The army became their family, their home, and their entire world. The routines, relationships, and rhythms of military life shaped their identities so completely that returning to civilian society after discharge could be profoundly disorienting. During their service, Roman soldiers faced restrictions on marriage. For much of Roman history, ordinary legionaries were forbidden from legally marrying. This prohibition was practical from the military's perspective. Married soldiers might prioritise families over military duty, might be less willing to transfer to distant postings, and might face divided loyalties. From the soldier's perspective, however, this restriction created enormous personal sacrifice. The marriage prohibition didn't prevent soldiers from forming relationships or having families. Many soldiers maintained unofficial partnerships with women, fathering children who legally couldn't be recognised as legitimate heirs during the father's service. These families existed in a legal grey area, lacking the protections and status that legal marriage would provide. Soldiers knew that if they died in service, their unofficial partners and children might face uncertain futures without legal recognition of the relationship. The extended commitment also meant missing crucial family events. Soldiers missed births, weddings, funerals, and the everyday moments that bind families together. Letters could maintain some connection, though literacy wasn't universal, and even literate soldiers might go months or years without opportunities to send or receive messages. Many soldiers effectively lost contact with their birth families, separated by vast distances and years of silence. Financial considerations complicated the commitment further. While soldiers received regular pay, the amounts weren't particularly generous, especially in the early years of service. Much of a soldier's pay went toward equipment, food supplements, and various military expenses deducted before soldiers even saw their wages. Building savings sufficient to establish civilian life after discharge required decades of careful management and significant self-denial. The commitment also included the possibility of dying far from home, in foreign lands, with no guarantee that one's remains would ever return to family or receive proper burial according to Roman custom. Soldiers knew that joining the legions might mean dying in Germania, Britannia, Syria, or any of dozens of other provinces buried in military cemeteries far from ancestral lands. This separation from home extended even beyond death. Yet despite these daunting commitments, men continued to join the legions. Some were driven by economic necessity. Military service offered steady pay and eventual land grants that poor citizens couldn't obtain otherwise. Others sought adventure, glory, or escape from difficult family situations. Still others came from military families where service was tradition. Whatever their motivations, they all faced the same reality. The next 25 years belonged to Rome. Once a recruit took the military oath, the real challenges began immediately with training that was designed to break down individual identity and rebuild recruits as disciplined soldiers. Roman military training was legendary for its intensity, and new recruits quickly learned why the legions inspired such respect and fear across the known world. The process was systematic, relentless, and deliberately demanding. The transformation began with basic physical conditioning. Recruits, regardless of their prior fitness levels, were subjected to exercise routines that pushed them to their limits. Running became a daily requirement, with distances gradually increasing until soldiers could maintain swift pace for hours. The goal wasn't just cardiovascular fitness. It was building the endurance needed to march 20 miles or more while carrying heavy equipment, then arrive at destinations ready to fight or construct fortifications. Marching drills consumed enormous portions of training time. Romans understood that the legion's power came partly from its ability to move quickly and arrive at battle sites in fighting condition. Recruits learned to march in formation, maintaining spacing and rhythm with hundreds of other men. They practiced on level ground, then on hills, then on rough terrain. They marched in good weather and foul, learning to maintain pace regardless of conditions. The march wasn't a simple walk. Soldiers carried their equipment, weapons, armour, tools, and personal supplies, while maintaining formation and discipline. The weight of this equipment was substantial, often 60 to 90 pounds or more. Training gradually increased the load as recruits built strength and endurance. A fully trained legionary could march 20 Roman miles, roughly 18 modern miles, in 5 hours while carrying full equipment, then immediately begin setting up camp or preparing for battle. Weapons training was equally intensive. Every recruit learned to use the gladius, the Roman short sword, pilum, javelin, and scutum, the large rectangular shield, that were the legionaries' primary weapons. Training didn't involve casual practice. It was systematic drilling repeated thousands of times until movements became automatic reflexes. The gladius required particular training because its use was quite specific. Unlike longer swords that might be swung in sweeping cuts, the gladius was primarily a thrusting weapon designed for close-quarters combat. Recruits practiced with wooden training swords, heavier than actual weapons, to build strength, thrusting at wooden posts that represented enemies. They would strike these posts repeatedly, aiming for specific target areas, building muscle memory until the correct movements came without conscious thought. Shield work was an art in itself. The scutum wasn't just defensive equipment, it was a weapon and tool. Soldiers learned to use shields for pushing in formation, creating walls of overlapping shields, and even as offensive weapons to strike opponents. The shield was heavy, curved, and awkward for untrained hands. Learning to manage it while simultaneously wielding a sword required coordination and strength that came only through endless practice. Javelin throwing demanded both strength and technique. The pilum was a specialised weapon, a heavy javelin designed to penetrate shields and armour. Its design included a soft iron shank that would bend on impact, making enemy shields unwieldy and preventing enemies from throwing Roman javelins back. Soldiers learned to throw pila in volleys, creating showers of projectiles that would strike enemy formations just before legionaries closed for hand-to-hand combat. Swimming was another required skill. Roman armies frequently encountered rivers, and soldiers needed to cross them whether bridges existed or not. Recruits who couldn't swim were taught, often in cold, uncomfortable conditions that left no room for gradual, pleasant learning. Swimming in full armour wasn't required, but soldiers did need to be confident enough in water to cross rivers using improvised rafts, or while clinging to equipment that served as flotation. Beyond individual skills, recruits learned to function as part of larger formations. Roman military success depended on units acting as cohesive wholes rather than collections of individuals. Soldiers learned to form the testudo, tortoise formation, where overlapping shields created protective cover overhead and on all sides. They practiced the wedge formation for breaking enemy lines, defensive squares, and various other tactical arrangements. These formation drills required trust and coordination. Each soldier's life depended on the men around him maintaining position and discipline. A soldier who broke formation or failed to keep pace endangered everyone. The training drilled this interdependence into soldiers, creating bonds of trust that extended beyond tactical necessity into deep personal loyalty. Mock battles provided opportunities to practice under conditions approximating actual combat, though with reduced danger. Recruits would face off in simulated engagements, using wooden weapons and wicker shields to prevent serious injuries while still providing physical contact and intensity. These exercises were highly competitive, with winning units receiving recognition, while losing units faced additional training. The training schedule left little time for rest. Days typically began before dawn and continued until evening, filled with drilling, marching, weapons practice, construction work, and physical conditioning. Recruits ate simple rations, slept in basic accommodations, and had virtually no leisure time. The intensity was deliberate. Officers wanted to identify who could endure military life and who would break under pressure. Better to discover a man's limits during training than during an actual campaign. Physical injuries were common during training. Twisted ankles, strained muscles, blistered feet, bruised limbs. These were accepted costs of preparing for war. The medical care available was basic, and soldiers were expected to continue training, unless injuries were genuinely incapacitating. Learning to function through discomfort and minor injuries was considered part of preparation for the hardships of campaign life. The psychological pressure matched the physical demands. Officers and veteran soldiers maintained constant pressure on recruits, shouting criticisms demanding better performance and tolerating no excuses. This wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was deliberate conditioning designed to prepare soldiers for the stress of combat. Men who would face enemy armies needed to function under pressure, follow orders amid chaos, and maintain discipline when everything around them suggested panic. Recruits who failed to meet standards faced various consequences. Additional drilling, reduced rations, public criticism, and assignment to unpleasant tasks motivated soldiers to improve. Those who couldn't or wouldn't meet minimum standards might be discharged, though this was relatively rare given the investment in training. More commonly, persistent struggling recruits were transferred to less demanding roles or auxiliary units with lower requirements. The training period lasted months, though exact duration varied by period and circumstances. By its end, successful recruits had been transformed physically and mentally. They were stronger, more enduring, skilled with weapons, and conditioned to obey orders instantly and unquestioningly. They had internalized military discipline and accepted their identities as soldiers. They were no longer civilians, they were legionaries, ready to join the units that would become their new families and their lives for the next 2 decades. Once training was complete and soldiers joined active units, they faced daily reality of carrying the equipment that made Roman legionaries such effective fighters. The popular image of Roman soldiers in gleaming armour doesn't convey the actual physical burden that this equipment represented. Modern military personnel, even those in combat roles, rarely carry loads as heavy as those borne by Roman legionaries on the march. The basic equipment set that every legionary needed was extensive. The armour itself, typically lorica segmentata, segmented plate armour, in the imperial period, weighed approximately 20 to 30 pounds. This might not sound enormous, but it was worn over a padded undergarment, distributed across shoulders, torso and back. In hot weather, the metal absorbed heat, turning armour into a personal oven. In cold conditions, metal conducted away body heat, creating a constant chill. The helmet added another 5 to 6 pounds, positioned on the head where its weight created neck strain during long marches. Roman helmets were well designed for protection, with cheek guards, brow reinforcement and neck protection, but this coverage came at the cost of added weight and reduced peripheral vision. Soldiers wore these helmets for hours during marches and had to remain alert despite the discomfort. The scutum, the large rectangular shield, was among the heaviest single items soldiers carried. Estimates for shield weight range from 15 to 22 pounds, depending on construction and time period. The shield was held by a horizontal grip, requiring constant arm and shoulder effort to maintain. Even when slung over the back during marches, the shield's size and weight made it awkward and tiring to transport. The gladius and scabbard added several more pounds, worn on a belt or baldric. The gladius was a relatively short sword, but its thick blade designed for thrusting meant it was heavier than its length might suggest. Additionally, most soldiers carried a pugio, dagger, as a backup weapon and general-purpose tool, adding another pound or two. 2 pila, javelins, were standard equipment, each weighing 4 to 5 pounds. These couldn't be worn conveniently and had to be carried, often on the shield side or bundled with other equipment. Their length, typically 6 to 7 feet, made them particularly awkward during marches, extending above the soldier's head or trailing below, constantly threatening to catch on obstacles or hit fellow soldiers. Beyond weapons and armour, soldiers carried extensive tools and camping equipment. The entrenching tool, a combination pick and shovel, was essential for the fortification work that accompanied every overnight stop. This tool weighed several pounds and had to be accessible, as it might be needed quickly if the units stopped to establish camp. Personal supplies added more weight. Soldiers carried several days' worth of grain rations, typically wheat or barley, that would be ground and cooked. The grain itself weighed 10 to 15 pounds depending on ration size. Cooking pots, wooden bowls and utensils added a few more pounds. Water containers, when full, added significant weight. Water is heavy. And soldiers in regions without reliable water sources had to carry enough for a day or more. Personal items, though minimised, still accumulated weight. A change of clothing, personal grooming items, perhaps a cloak for cold weather, religious items or lucky charms, writing materials for those who were literate. These seemingly small items added up. The Roman military encouraged soldiers to travel light, but certain personal items were necessities that couldn't be abandoned. The collective weight of all this equipment is estimated at between 60 and 90 pounds, though exact figures depend on period, unit type, and specific circumstances. For perspective, modern military recommendations suggest that soldiers shouldn't carry more than about a third of their body weight for extended marches. Roman legionaries often exceeded this guideline significantly, particularly smaller men who might weigh only 130 to 150 pounds but still carried the standard equipment load. Carrying this weight for 20 miles or more in a day demanded extraordinary physical strength and endurance. The weight wasn't evenly distributed. Some items could be balanced, but others created awkward pressure points. Armour straps dug into shoulders, shield weight pulled on arms, the helmet's weight strained neck muscles, equipment rubbed against legs and hips, creating friction and sore spots that would worsen over days of marching. The furka, a forked pole over the shoulder from which equipment could be suspended, helped distribute weight somewhat. Soldiers would bundle tools, cooking gear and other items onto this pole, creating something like a military version of a hobo's bindle. This didn't reduce the total weight, but did allow for better distribution, taking some burden off shoulders and back by engaging different muscle groups. Despite these burdens, soldiers were expected to arrive at destinations ready for immediate action. If enemies attacked during a march, legionaries had to quickly transition from march mode to combat readiness. This meant dropping packs but immediately deploying weapons and shields to meet threats. The ability to make this transition quickly, even after hours of exhausting march, was a crucial skill that training emphasised repeatedly. The equipment burden didn't end with personal gear. Units also had collective equipment that soldiers rotated responsibility for carrying. Large leather tents that housed 8-man contubernium squad units, millstones for grinding grain, heavy cooking equipment, engineering tools for major construction projects, spare weapons and armour components. All of this had to be transported when units moved. Some of this collective equipment could be loaded onto mules or wagons when available, but Roman military doctrine emphasised speed and mobility. Heavy baggage trains slowed armies, made them vulnerable to raids, and restricted where they could travel. Generals preferred soldiers who could carry their own supplies, allowing armies to move quickly across varied terrain without dependence on wheeled transport that required decent roads. The burden affected every aspect of soldier life. Chronic back pain, joint problems, and repetitive stress injuries were common. Feet suffered particularly. Blisters, calluses, and various foot problems plagued soldiers on campaign. The military-issued sandals, caligae, were well designed by ancient standards, but they couldn't prevent all the problems associated with carrying heavy loads over long distances. Sleep, when finally achieved after a long march and camp construction, brought temporary relief, though soldiers slept in armour often enough that even rest didn't provide complete respite from equipment weight. In hostile territory, soldiers might sleep in full armour except for helmets, ready to respond immediately if attacked. The leather tent provided shelter but not comfort. 8 men with all their equipment created cramped conditions where personal space was non-existent. If there was one activity that defined Roman military life more than any other, it was marching. Legionaries spent vastly more time marching than fighting. Campaigns involved days or weeks of continuous movement, punctuated by occasional battles. Even when not on active campaign, soldiers engaged in regular training marches to maintain fitness and conditioning. The march was fundamental to Roman military power. Legions could move faster than most ancient armies while maintaining cohesion and arriving ready to fight. The standard pace of a Roman march was demanding by any measure. Historical sources suggest that legions covered approximately 20 Roman miles, roughly 18 modern miles, during a typical day's march, completing this distance in about 5 hours of actual movement. This works out to roughly 3 to 4 miles per hour while carrying 50 to 90 pounds of equipment, a pace that would challenge modern hikers on a day trip, much less soldiers sustaining it day after day. The march began early, often before dawn. Soldiers would break camp, pack equipment and form up in marching order, all completed in darkness or pre-dawn twilight. This early start allowed units to cover distance before the day's heat peaked, particularly important in warmer climates where afternoon sun could be genuinely dangerous to heavily laden men. Marching formation was carefully structured. Units didn't simply walk along roads in loose groups, they maintained organisation and spacing. The legendary obsession with order wasn't just for show, it was tactical necessity. A disorganised army struggling along a road could be attacked and destroyed easily. Maintaining formation during marches kept the legion ready to respond to threats, while also ensuring that slower units didn't lag so far behind that they became vulnerable. The condition of roads dramatically affected the march experience. Roman armies famously built roads throughout the empire, creating infrastructure that still impresses 2,000 years later. However, many campaigns occurred in regions where Roman roads didn't exist or were poorly maintained. Soldiers regularly marched on dirt tracks, across open countryside, through forests, over mountains, and through marshlands where proper roads were unavailable. Marching on good roads was physically demanding but straightforward. The even surface and solid footing allowed steady pace. Marching cross-country was far more difficult. Uneven terrain required constant attention to foot placement. Mud sucked at Calagay, adding effort to every step. Hills demanded extra energy to climb while offering different but equally taxing challenges during descent. River crossings might require building temporary bridges or fording, getting thoroughly wet in the process. Weather added additional challenges. Summer heat exhausted soldiers quickly, with heavy armour turning them into mobile ovens. The risk of heat stroke was real, particularly for men unused to hot climates. Mediterranean summers could be brutally hot, and soldiers marching in places like Egypt, North Africa or the Middle East faced temperatures that regularly exceeded comfort levels. Cold weather brought opposite but equally serious challenges. Winter campaigns were dreaded for good reason. Marching through snow or ice, while carrying heavy equipment, tested endurance to its limits. Metal armour and weapons conducted cold directly to the body. Fingers and toes went numb, making it difficult to handle equipment properly. The heavy woolen cloaks that soldiers wore in cold weather added to their burden while providing only limited protection against truly bitter conditions. Rain was perhaps the most common weather challenge. Soldiers marched through rain regularly, becoming soaked despite cloaks and other attempts at protection. Wet clothing chafed, wet leather equipment became heavier and prone to damage, and wet feet developed blisters and other problems. Multi-day marches in rainy conditions meant soldiers never really dried out, leading to misery and health complications. The physical toll accumulated over days and weeks of continuous marching. Feet suffered particularly. Even with well-designed military sandals, blisters were inevitable. These blisters would form, break, and form again, creating painful conditions that soldiers simply had to endure. Infection was a constant risk, and foot injuries that became infected could incapacitate soldiers, or, in severe cases, prove life-threatening. Joint pain, particularly in knees and ankles, became chronic for soldiers who marched extensively. The repetitive impact of thousands of steps while carrying heavy loads wore on joints, causing inflammation and long-term damage. Backs ached from equipment weight distributed across shoulders and spine. Hip problems developed from the way equipment belts and straps pressed against the body during movement. The psychological impact of endless marching shouldn't be underestimated. The monotony was crushing. Hour after hour of putting one foot in front of the other, watching the back of the soldier ahead, unable to stop or slow down regardless of discomfort or fatigue. This wore on morale and mental health. The knowledge that today's march would be followed by tomorrow's, and another the day after, stretching on indefinitely, created psychological weight as heavy as physical burdens. Soldiers learned to enter semi-meditative states during long marches, partially disconnecting from immediate physical discomfort, while maintaining enough awareness to keep formation and watch for hazards. Conversations helped pass time, though maintaining conversation while marching required breath and energy that soldiers couldn't always spare. Songs and chants served similar purposes, creating rhythm and distraction from discomfort. The arrival at the day's camping location didn't bring rest. It brought more work. Before soldiers could eat, before they could tend to feet and equipment, before any rest was possible, they had to construct fortifications. This requirement was nearly universal, enforced even when enemies weren't nearby. Roman military doctrine held that proper fortification provided security, maintained discipline, and kept soldiers occupied in useful work that prevented the boredom and mischief that idle soldiers might pursue. The requirement to build fortifications at every overnight stop was one of the most distinctive and demanding aspects of Roman military practice. While other ancient armies might set up simple camps, Roman legions constructed elaborate fortified enclosures complete with ditches, ramparts, gates, and internal organisation. This wasn't optional or reserved for situations where enemy contact was expected. It was standard procedure regardless of circumstances. The process began as soon as the legion stopped for the day. Officers and specialists would lay out the camp plan, marking where ditches should be dug, where ramparts constructed, where gates positioned, and how internal streets and tent areas would be organised. Roman camps followed standardised designs, meaning soldiers always knew where their unit would be positioned relative to others, and where key facilities would be located. The first task was digging the defensive ditch, the fossa, that surrounded the entire camp perimeter. This wasn't a minor trench. The standard ditch was typically 9 to 12 feet wide and 6 to 9 feet deep, creating a substantial obstacle that enemies couldn't easily cross. For a camp housing a full legion of several thousand men, the perimeter might be several miles around. This meant soldiers had to excavate thousands of cubic feet of earth while already exhausted from the day's march. Every soldier participated in fortification work using the entrenching tools they'd carried all day. These weren't sophisticated implements, basically picks and shovels of ancient design, but they were effective. Working in teams, soldiers would dig sections of the ditch, piling excavated soil on the campsite to form the rampart. The agger, or rampart, was constructed from the earth removed when digging the ditch. This embankment had to be built up to useful height, typically 6 to 10 feet above the original ground level. The soil couldn't simply be piled randomly, it had to be packed and shaped to create a stable rampart that wouldn't collapse. The front face of the rampart was often reinforced with timber or turf to prevent erosion and provide additional stability. Stakes, carried by soldiers during the march, were placed along the top of the rampart. These sharpened wooden poles created an additional barrier, making the rampart difficult to assault. Each soldier typically carried 2 or 3 stakes bundled with their equipment, and when multiplied across thousands of men, this provided sufficient stakes to fortify the camp's entire perimeter. Gates required special attention. The camp typically had 4 gates positioned at cardinal points, allowing entry and exit from multiple directions. These gates needed to be easily defended yet functional for the traffic they would handle. Soldiers constructed gate structures using portable materials, creating defensible positions that could be quickly assembled and disassembled. Inside the camp, internal organisation had to be established quickly. Streets were laid out in grid patterns, creating orderly flow through the camp. Tent lines were positioned according to unit assignments. Command areas were established. Latrines were dug in designated areas away from living spaces but still within the fortifications. Water sources, if the camp was near a river or stream, had to be accessed while maintaining security. All of this work had to be completed before soldiers could attend to personal needs. They couldn't eat until fortifications were functional and internal organisation established. They couldn't rest until their tent was erected and their space prepared. For soldiers who'd already marched 20 miles carrying heavy equipment, the additional hours of construction work pushed physical endurance to its limits. The time required for camp construction varied by circumstances, but even under good conditions with experienced troops, the process took several hours. Starting camp construction in late afternoon or evening meant finishing after dark, requiring soldiers to work by firelight or moonlight to complete fortifications and establish living areas. Only after all collective work was done could individuals finally focus on personal needs, cooking dinner, tending to equipment, addressing foot problems, and preparing to sleep. The requirement to build fortifications every night meant that soldiers rarely got more than a few hours of sleep during active campaigns. Between the time spent marching, the hours consumed by construction work, the time needed to prepare and eat food, and the watch duties that all soldiers rotated through during the night, sleep was a precious commodity that soldiers learned to grab in whatever quantities they could manage. Morning brought the reverse process, striking camp. Fortifications that took hours to construct were abandoned the next morning, seemingly wasted labour. The ditch remained, but the rampart was scattered, stakes were collected, gates were dismantled, and the site was left as the legion marched onward. This daily construction and abandonment cycle seemed inefficient, but Roman commanders valued the discipline, security, and routine it provided over concerns about wasted effort. The requirement did occasionally have exceptions. During longer stops or in winter quarters, camps evolved into more permanent installations. Semi-permanent fortifications with more sophisticated construction replaced daily temporary camps. These longer-term camps allowed soldiers to invest more effort in comfort and convenience, building more substantial shelters and amenities. However, during active campaign seasons, the daily cycle of march, construct, sleep, abandon, and repeat became the grinding rhythm of military life. The fortification work built skills that proved valuable in other contexts. Soldiers became proficient in construction, engineering, and earthworks. These skills were applied to building permanent forts, constructing roads, building bridges, and various other civil engineering projects that occupied soldiers when they weren't on campaign. The Roman Empire's impressive infrastructure was built largely by military labour, with legions functioning as construction crews as much as fighting forces. However, The immediate experience for soldiers was grueling physical labour, added to already exhausting days. The combination of marching and construction created total daily physical output that would challenge modern athletes. That Roman soldiers sustained this workload for weeks or months during campaigns, then returned to training and garrison duties afterward, speaks to the incredible physical conditioning and mental toughness that the military system developed. Food in the Roman military was functional rather than enjoyable. Soldiers received rations designed to provide basic nutrition and energy, but palatability was secondary concern at best. The diet was monotonous, simple, and rarely satisfying, representing another daily hardship that soldiers had to endure throughout their service. The foundation of military rations was grain, primarily wheat or occasionally barley. Soldiers received approximately 3 pounds of grain per day, which provided substantial calories but required preparation before it could be eaten. The grain wasn't issued as bread or prepared food. It came as whole grain that soldiers had to process themselves, using whatever time and resources were available. Processing grain began with grinding it into flour. Units were issued with portable millstones, but these were shared among groups of soldiers, creating bottlenecks when everyone needed to grind grain simultaneously. Individual soldiers or small groups would take turns at the millstones, grinding their daily ration into coarse flour. This process was time-consuming and physically tiring, requiring sustained effort to rotate the upper millstone against the lower one while feeding grain through the central hole. Once ground, the flour could be used in several ways. The most common preparation was probably a simple porridge-like mixture called pulse, or pultamentum, made by cooking flour with water into a thick, filling mash. This wasn't elegant cuisine, but it was efficient. It required only a pot, water, and heat, all of which were generally available even in field conditions. The resulting porridge was bland, thick, and filling, providing calories and basic nutrition without much in the way of flavour or enjoyment. Alternatively, flour could be mixed with water and formed into simple flatbreads, cooked on hot stones or metal plates. These unleavened breads were probably more appetising than porridge, but required more time and attention to prepare. Soldiers had to balance convenience against palatability, often choosing the quicker option when time was limited or conditions were difficult. Beyond grain, soldiers received small allotments of other foods when available. Salt was essential both for flavour and as a dietary necessity. The human body needs sodium, and soldiers working physically in hot conditions lost significant salt through sweat. The word salary derives from salarium, the salt allowance that Roman soldiers received, indicating how important this commodity was. Oil, typically olive oil when available, provided fat that the grain-heavy diet otherwise lacked. A small amount of oil could make grain dishes significantly more palatable, and provided essential dietary fats. However, oil supplies were limited and often insufficient, particularly during campaigns in regions where olive oil had to be transported over long distances. Sour wine, or posca, a mixture of water and vinegar, was the standard beverage. This wasn't quality wine that anyone would drink for pleasure. It was harsh, acidic, and not particularly refreshing. But it was safer than plain water and provided some vitamin C that helped prevent scurvy on extended campaigns. Posca was sufficiently unpleasant that it was mentioned in accounts as a symbol of military hardship, yet soldiers drank it daily because alternatives were limited. Vegetables, when available, added variety and nutrition. Soldiers might receive onions, garlic, turnips, or cabbage as supplements to the basic grain ration. However, these additions were irregular and depended on what could be sourced locally or brought from supply depots. Fresh vegetables spoiled quickly, so they couldn't be relied upon during extended campaigns away from supply sources. Meat was rare in the daily ration, appearing primarily during special occasions or when local foraging provided opportunities. When meat did appear, it was typically preserved through salting or smoking, making it tough, salty, and not particularly appetizing. Fresh meat was an unusual luxury that marked special celebrations rather than ordinary meals. Legumes, beans, lentils, peas supplemented grain when available, providing protein and variety. These could be added to porridge or cooked separately, creating somewhat more interesting meals than plain grain. However, like vegetables, legume supplies were irregular and often insufficient. Cheese provided another protein source that stored better than fresh meat. hard cheeses could withstand transport and storage reasonably well, making them practical for military use. A piece of cheese with flatbread made a reasonably satisfying meal, though again, this was dependent on supplies being available. The monotony of this diet was crushing. Day after day of similar meals with few variations turned eating from pleasure into mere fuel consumption. Modern people accustomed to varied diets might struggle to imagine eating essentially the same meal. Grain porridge or flatbread with perhaps some oil, a piece of cheese and sour wine, for weeks or months on end. The lack of variety wasn't just boring, it was demoralizing. Nutritional deficiencies were common despite the substantial caloric content of rations. The diet, heavy in grain but light in fresh vegetables and meat, could lead to various health problems. Scurvy was a risk during prolonged campaigns without fresh produce. Other vitamin and mineral deficiencies affected soldiers' health, creating susceptibility to illness and slower healing from wounds. Soldiers supplemented official rations however they could. Foraging was common when the army moved through countryside, though this was officially controlled to prevent abuses against civilian populations and maintain discipline. Hunting and fishing provided occasional fresh food. Local markets near camps offered opportunities for soldiers with spare money to purchase additional food. However, these supplementary sources were unreliable and not available to all soldiers equally. Those with money could buy better food. Those with useful skills might trade for extra rations. Those with neither had to survive on official rations alone, which meant enduring the monotonous diet with no relief. Meal preparation consumed significant time and effort. After long marches and construction work, soldiers still had to grind grain, gather fuel for fires, cook their meals, and clean up afterward. This extended the workday further, eating into the precious few hours that might otherwise be used for rest. Soldiers learned to prepare meals quickly and efficiently, but even the most streamlined process took time that already exhausted men could barely spare. Shared cooking arrangements within the 8-man contubernium helped distribute labour. Soldiers would rotate cooking duties, allowing some men to rest while others prepared meals. This system required trust and cooperation. A soldier's dinner depended on his tent mates preparing food competently. These shared responsibilities strengthened bonds between tent mates, creating small group loyalty that was fundamental to unit cohesion. The requirement to carry cooking equipment and rations added to the burden of the march. Pots, utensils, grain supplies, and fuel all had weight that soldiers carried. Running low on rations created anxiety about when resupply would arrive. The hunger that came during times when rations were short or when supply lines were disrupted added physical discomfort to the already challenging conditions of campaign life. The living conditions that Roman soldiers endured represented another source of constant discomfort and challenges. Whether in temporary campaign camps or more permanent garrison forts, the spaces where soldiers spent their off-duty hours were cramped, Spartan, and offered little privacy or comfort by modern standards. The basic living unit was the contubernium, a group of 8 soldiers who shared a tent or barrack room. This wasn't a matter of choice. Soldiers were assigned to these units and had to coexist with their tent mates throughout their service. In the field, the contubernium shared a leather tent that provided basic shelter but little else. The tent was roughly 10 feet by 10 feet, creating 100 square feet of space for 8 men and all their equipment. 100 square feet sounds larger than it actually felt. Consider that each soldier had extensive equipment, armour, weapons, tools, personal supplies, and more, that had to be stored somewhere. Much of this equipment was simply piled inside the tent, reducing the usable space considerably. The actual floor space where men could sit, lie down, and exist was far less than 100 square feet when equipment storage was factored in. 8 men sleeping in such close quarters meant there was essentially no personal space. Soldiers slept side by side with perhaps inches between them. Rolling over at night meant potentially disturbing tent mates. Snoring, body odour, and various other nighttime disturbances affected everyone in the confined space. Privacy was completely non-existent. Any personal activity, from changing clothes to dealing with illness, occurred in full view of 7 other men. The tent itself provided minimal protection from weather. Leather was somewhat water-resistant when properly maintained, but prolonged rain could still penetrate, creating damp conditions inside. The tent had no floor beyond perhaps some rushes or straw scattered on the ground, meaning that ground moisture and cold penetrated from below. Ventilation was limited, creating stuffy conditions when the tent was closed, but drafty cold when it had to be left partially open for air circulation. Temperature regulation was challenging. In cold weather, 8 bodies in close proximity generated some warmth, but this was often insufficient against genuinely cold conditions. Soldiers would sleep in their cloaks, sometimes in armour, using their body heat and whatever coverings they had to stay warm. In hot weather, the opposite problem arose. The tent became an oven with poor ventilation, making sleep difficult and uncomfortable. The social dynamics within a contubernium were crucial to a soldier's quality of life. Getting along with tent mates made military life more bearable. Personality conflicts, however, created misery in such close quarters. A soldier couldn't escape from tent mates he disliked. They were his constant companions during marches, his roommates in camp, his squad in combat. Disputes had to be resolved somehow because the alternatives, escalating conflict or requesting transfers, were rarely practical. Successful contubernia developed their own internal cultures and dynamics. Roles emerged organically. Someone became known as a skilled cook, another as the one who could repair equipment, a third as the peacemaker who smoothed over conflicts. These internal hierarchies and role specializations helped 8 men function as a cohesive unit, despite the challenges of living in such proximity. In permanent garrison forts, accommodations were somewhat more substantial but still Spartan. Barrack buildings provided rooms for contubernia, offering more protection from weather than tents, but maintaining the same basic arrangement of 8 men per unit. The rooms in barracks might be slightly larger than tents, perhaps offering 150 to 200 square feet, but this was still cramped for 8 occupants with their equipment. Barrack rooms typically had 1 or 2 small windows for light and ventilation, though these were small to prevent excessive cold in winter. Interior lighting came from oil lamps or candles when available, though these were expensive and soldiers often made do with minimal light. Furniture was minimal, perhaps a bench or 2, some hooks on walls for hanging equipment, and little else. Soldiers slept on simple platforms or directly on floors with bedrolls providing minimal cushioning. Heating in barracks was rudimentary. Some forts had hypercourse systems, underfloor heating, in privileged areas like officers' quarters or bath complexes, but ordinary barracks rarely enjoyed such luxury. Braziers might provide some warmth, though fuel was expensive and their use was often restricted to prevent fires. Soldiers learned to endure cold conditions, sleeping in multiple layers and using their heavy cloaks as blankets. Sanitation in living quarters was basic. There were no private bathrooms attached to barrack rooms or included within tents. Soldiers used communal latrines that might be located some distance from sleeping quarters. Nighttime trips to latrines required leaving the warmth and safety of sleeping areas to venture into darkness and cold, a prospect unpleasant enough that soldiers often put off such trips until absolutely necessary. Personal hygiene was challenging in such close quarters. Without private spaces, bathing, shaving, and other grooming activities occurred in full view of tent or roommates. The process of maintaining equipment, cleaning and repairing armour, sharpening weapons, oiling leather, also happened in these cramped communal spaces, with multiple soldiers attempting to accomplish various tasks simultaneously in limited space. Storage of personal possessions was extremely limited. Soldiers owned little beyond their issued equipment and a few personal items, partly because there was simply nowhere to keep more. What personal items soldiers did have, letters from home, religious items, small mementos, had to be carefully safeguarded in such close quarters where theft was always a possibility, despite military discipline. The lack of privacy extended to all aspects of life. Soldiers had no private moments, no quiet spaces to retreat to when they needed solitude. For men who might be naturally introverted or who valued personal space, this constant companionship was genuinely distressing. Even extroverts who enjoyed social interaction would occasionally want time alone, but military life provided virtually none. The crowded living conditions also facilitated the spread of illness. When one member of a contubernium became ill, others often followed. Respiratory infections, gastrointestinal problems, parasitic infestations, and various other communicable conditions spread rapidly in such close quarters. The military's medical services tried to address this by quarantining severely ill soldiers, but mild illnesses were simply endured, spreading through units as soldiers continued to live and work in proximity. Despite these challenges, Soldiers developed strong bonds with their tent or roommates. The forced intimacy created either deep friendship or at least working relationships built on mutual reliance. Soldiers who lived, marched and fought together for years developed loyalty that often lasted beyond their military service. Many veterans maintained connections with their old tent mates long after discharge, the shared hardships creating bonds that peaceful civilian life couldn't replicate. Perhaps no aspect of Roman military life was as defining as the strict discipline that governed every moment of a soldier's existence. The Roman legions were legendary, not just for their fighting prowess, but for their rigid adherence to rules, regulations, and hierarchical authority. This discipline created military effectiveness, but it also meant that soldiers lived under constant scrutiny and faced consequences for even minor infractions. Every action, from how soldiers wore their equipment, to how they addressed superiors, to how they conducted themselves both on and off duty, was governed by regulations. These weren't casual guidelines. They were strictly enforced rules with real consequences for violations. The soldier couldn't cut corners, couldn't decide that certain rules didn't apply to him, couldn't ignore orders he found inconvenient. Military discipline demanded perfect obedience at all times. Officers at various levels, from the centurions who commanded individual centuries, units of roughly 80 men, to the tribunes and legates commanding larger formations, maintained this discipline through constant oversight and swift correction of problems. Centurions in particular were known for their strict enforcement of standards. These experienced soldiers had authority to correct, punish, and maintain order within their units, and they used this authority liberally. The centurion's vine staff, carried as a symbol of office, served both symbolic and practical purposes. The staff represented authority, but it was also used for corporal punishment, striking soldiers who failed to meet standards or who showed disrespect. This wasn't considered abuse. It was normal enforcement of discipline. Soldiers accepted that they would be struck occasionally for mistakes or laziness, considering this part of military life. Punishments for more serious infractions range from unpleasant to genuinely harsh. Extra duties represented one of the milder consequences. Soldiers who broke minor rules might be assigned additional work details, longer guard shifts, or unpleasant tasks like latrine cleaning. These punishments were inconvenient and tiring, but didn't constitute serious penalties. Reduction of rations was another punishment tool. Soldiers who misbehaved might receive smaller portions, be denied certain foods, or have to subsist on minimal supplies for periods of days. Given the already monotonous and often insufficient diet, this reduction created real hardship. Hunger focused the mind wonderfully on avoiding future infractions. For more serious violations, more severe consequences applied. These included confinement, hard labour, reduction in rank, transfer to less prestigious units, or in extreme cases discharge from the military. The exact nature of punishments evolved over Roman history and varied somewhat by commander and circumstances, but the principle remained constant. Violations would be punished swiftly and certainly. One particularly harsh punishment was decimation, though this was rare and reserved for extreme situations like unit-wide cowardice or mutiny. The name comes from the Latin for a tenth. Literally every 10th man in the unit was selected by lot, and then removed from service in permanent fashion by his fellow soldiers. This collective punishment created powerful incentives for soldiers to police each other's behaviour, knowing that one man's actions could result in random selection for extreme penalty. Less extreme but still serious was the practice of punishing entire units for collective failures. If a unit failed to complete assigned work, showed poor performance in training, or collectively broke rules, the entire unit faced consequences. This might include reduced rations, additional labour, or public humiliation. The purpose was to foster unit cohesion and ensure that soldiers encouraged proper behaviour among their comrades. Military discipline also governed leave and liberty. Soldiers couldn't simply leave their posts or forts when they wished. Passes for time away from duty were granted sparingly and subject to immediate recall. Even when granted leave, soldiers remained subject to military law and could be recalled at any time for any reason. The freedom that civilians took for granted was almost entirely absent from soldiers' lives. The rigid schedule that structured military life allowed for virtually no flexibility. Soldiers woke when ordered, ate when scheduled, trained according to plan, performed assigned duties when directed, and slept when permitted. Individual preferences or needs were irrelevant. The military schedule determined everything. A soldier who was sick still had to attempt assigned tasks unless incapacitated sufficiently to be excused by medical personnel. Fatigue, soreness, minor injuries, and general unwillingness to perform duties were not acceptable excuses. Social hierarchy within the military was strictly maintained. Soldiers showed deference to anyone of higher rank, which included most officers and many fellow enlisted men who had been promoted or who held specialised positions. Failure to show proper respect could result in immediate punishment. The social stratification that characterised Roman civilian life was replicated and amplified within the military, creating layers of authority and subordination that soldiers had to navigate constantly. The legal system that governed soldiers was separate from civilian law. Soldiers were subject to military justice, administered by their commanders according to military regulations. Civilian courts had limited jurisdiction over soldiers, meaning that military personnel essentially lived under a different legal framework than the civilians they protected. This military justice system prioritised discipline and unit cohesion over individual rights or fairness in the modern sense. One aspect of military discipline that particularly impacted soldiers was the restriction on their economic activities. Soldiers received pay, but their ability to engage in business, own property, or pursue economic opportunities was limited. The military wanted soldiers focused entirely on military duties without distraction from personal financial concerns. This meant that soldiers had few options for improving their economic situation beyond the standard pay and benefits that military service provided. The psychological impact of living under such rigid discipline was significant. Some soldiers thrived in the structure, finding security in clear rules and expectations. Others chafed under the constant restrictions, finding the lack of personal autonomy oppressive. Most fell somewhere in between, adapting to military discipline as a necessary aspect of their chosen profession, while privately resenting some restrictions even as they outwardly complied. The discipline system did provide certain protections for soldiers. Officers couldn't arbitrarily remove soldiers from service, couldn't reduce pay without cause, and faced some limitations on their authority. Soldiers had access to appeals processes, though these were limited and success was far from guaranteed. The system, while harsh, did have rules that theoretically protected soldiers from the most extreme abuses. Despite its harshness, Roman military discipline created units that could execute complex maneuvers, maintain cohesion under pressure, and function effectively across the diverse conditions and challenges that the military faced. The price of this effectiveness was paid in individual freedom and personal autonomy, costs that soldiers accepted when they took their military oath. The physical demands and living conditions of Roman military life took significant tolls on soldiers' health. Disease, injury, malnutrition, and accumulated stress from harsh conditions created constant health challenges. While Roman military medicine was actually quite advanced for its time, the reality was that soldiers faced numerous health problems throughout their service. Common illness spread rapidly through military units due to crowded living conditions and close contact. Respiratory infections, coughs, colds, bronchitis, pneumonia passed easily from soldier to soldier, particularly in cold, damp conditions when soldiers were living in poorly ventilated tents or barracks. What started as one sniffling soldier could become an entire unit dealing with respiratory illness within days. Gastrointestinal problems were endemic, caused by contaminated water, inadequate food sanitation, parasites, and the general hygiene challenges of military life. Soldiers suffered regularly from stomach pains, diarrhea, and related complaints. In an era before understanding of bacterial and viral causes, these illnesses were simply accepted as part of life. Treatment options were limited, and soldiers generally had to continue with duties unless too incapacitated to function. Parasitic infections affected many soldiers. Intestinal worms from contaminated food or water, lice from close living quarters, and various other parasites found Roman military units to be ideal environments. These infestations caused chronic discomfort and health problems, though they were so common that they were considered normal rather than exceptional conditions requiring special attention. Injuries were constant concerns. Training accidents, construction mishaps, marching injuries, and combat wounds created steady streams of soldiers needing medical attention. Blisters and foot problems from endless marching affected virtually every soldier at some point. Sprains, strains, and overuse injuries from heavy equipment and constant physical demands were common. More serious injuries from accidents, falls, equipment mishaps, construction accidents occurred regularly. Roman military medicine had developed fairly sophisticated approaches to trauma care. Military surgeons understood the importance of wound cleaning, had techniques for controlling bleeding, could perform amputations when necessary, and had various surgical instruments that showed genuine medical thinking. Soldiers injured in battle or accidents received care that was quite advanced by ancient standards. However, even good surgical technique couldn't overcome the fundamental limitation that ancient medicine lacked: understanding of infection and antibiotics to treat it. Wounds that would be minor inconveniences with modern medical care could become life-threatening infections in Roman times. Surgeons cleaned wounds as best they could, but without antiseptics or antibiotics, infection remained a major killer. Many soldiers died not from their initial injuries, but from infections that developed afterward. Military hospitals, called valetudinaria, were established at major forts and provided somewhat better medical care than field conditions allowed. These facilities had dedicated medical staff, surgical equipment, and space for treating and recuperating soldiers. The discovery of hospital complexes at Roman military sites reveals sophisticated thinking about medical care. Separate wards, surgery areas, storage for medicines and equipment, showing that Roman military medical thinking was quite advanced. However, capacity was limited, and seriously ill or injured soldiers might have to wait for treatment or receive care in less than ideal conditions. The quality of care also depended heavily on the skill of available medical personnel. A soldier fortunate enough to be treated by a skilled surgeon might recover from serious wounds. A soldier treated by less competent medical staff might succumb to conditions that better treatment could have addressed. Pain management was primitive by modern standards. Opium-based preparations provided some pain relief and were used particularly for serious injuries or post-surgical care. However, these were expensive and not always available. Soldiers often had to endure significant pain with minimal pharmaceutical help. Alcohol might be used to dull pain, but this was hardly a satisfactory solution for serious conditions. Dental health was a particular challenge. Soldiers suffered from tooth decay, gum disease, and dental infections just like civilians, but their diet, heavy in grain, often containing stone fragments from grinding, was particularly hard on teeth. The constant grinding action of eating coarse bread wore down tooth enamel. Dental abscesses were both painful and potentially dangerous, as infections could spread from teeth to more serious locations. Treatment for dental problems was limited to extraction. A soldier with a painful tooth could have it pulled, a procedure performed without anaesthesia and with tools that were crude by modern standards. Many soldiers chose to endure dental pain as long as possible, rather than face the traumatic experience of extraction. By the time soldiers completed their 25-year service, many had lost multiple teeth, affecting their ability to eat and their overall health. Chronic conditions that developed from years of military service, joint problems from carrying heavy loads, back pain from equipment weight, hearing damage from proximity to battle noise, and various other long-term health issues couldn't be effectively treated with ancient medicine. Soldiers simply lived with these problems, accepting them as consequences of military life. Pain and discomfort became constant companions that soldiers learned to endure. Now, mental health challenges weren't understood in modern terms, but soldiers certainly suffered from what we'd now recognise as depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress. The constant stress of military life, the trauma of combat, separation from families, and the accumulation of hardships took psychological tolls. Roman medicine had no framework for understanding or treating these conditions, so soldiers experiencing mental health problems had no real avenue for help beyond the informal support of comrades. The medical discharge system did provide a way out for soldiers who became too ill or injured to continue service. Soldiers who were genuinely incapacitated could be honourably discharged before completing their full term, receiving some benefits even though their service was shortened. However, the bar for medical discharge was high. Soldiers had to be unable to perform basic duties. Many soldiers with chronic conditions or injuries that would disqualify people from service in modern militaries had to continue serving because their conditions, while problematic, weren't completely incapacitating. Perhaps the hardest aspect of Roman military service to quantify, yet among the most significant for soldiers' quality of life, was the emotional toll of long separation from family and home. The 25-year commitment meant that soldiers spent the prime years of their lives far from the people and places they knew, living among strangers in unfamiliar lands, creating a profound sense of loss and displacement. Young men who joined the legions typically did so in their late teens or early 20s. At this age, many had families, parents, siblings, perhaps childhood friends, who formed their social world. Joining the military meant leaving all of this behind, often moving hundreds or even thousands of miles away to posts in distant provinces. The emotional impact of this separation was immediate and ongoing. Communication with home was difficult and irregular. Literacy was limited in Roman society. So many soldiers and their families couldn't read or write. Even literate soldiers faced challenges in maintaining correspondence. Writing materials were expensive, opportunities to send letters were sporadic, and the postal system, while impressive by ancient standards, was slow and uncertain. A letter might take weeks or months to reach its destination, assuming it arrived at all. The result was that many soldiers lost effective contact with their families. Letters might arrive once or twice a year if soldiers were fortunate, providing brief glimpses of life at home, but also highlighting how much was being missed. Parents aged, siblings married and had children, friends moved on with their lives, and the soldier stationed in Germania, Britannia or Syria experienced all of this as distant reports rather than lived reality. The prohibition on marriage during service created particular hardship for many soldiers. Young men at the age when they would normally be establishing families instead had to remain unmarried, watching their civilian peers court, marry, and start families while military regulations prevented them from doing the same. The loneliness this created was profound, contributing to the sense of isolation that characterized military life. Soldiers did form relationships despite regulations. Many soldiers had unofficial partners and fathered children who lived near military posts. However, these relationships existed in legal limbo. The partners had no legal status as wives. Children had no legal claim to inheritance or support, and if the soldier died or was transferred, the family had no legal protections. This uncertain status created anxiety and hardship for soldiers who tried to maintain family connections despite military prohibitions. The children born to these unofficial unions grew up knowing their fathers were soldiers, but lacking the legal and social status that legitimate children enjoyed. Fathers stationed nearby could maintain some relationship with children, visiting when duties permitted and providing support as they were able. However, transfers or campaign deployments could separate fathers from children for years at a time, creating relationships that were distant and irregular at best. When soldiers finally gained the right to legally marry after completing their service, many legalized long-standing relationships and legitimized children who might be approaching adulthood themselves. The legal recognition that came with discharge was important, but it couldn't restore the years when these families existed in uncertain legal and social positions. The military system's recognition of this separation issue led to the development of communities around military posts. These vici, or civilian settlements, grew up adjacent to forts, providing commercial services, housing for soldiers' families, and social life for soldiers. These communities allowed some softening of the harsh separation that service demanded, though they also created their own complications and challenges. Soldiers who formed deep friendships with tent mates and unit members found some substitute for family connections in these military relationships. The 8 men of a contubernium, living in such close proximity and depending on each other, often developed bonds as close as familial relationships. These friendships could be genuine sources of emotional support and connection, helping soldiers cope with separation from biological families. However, military friendships couldn't entirely replace family connections. Parents who were aging and needed support, siblings facing difficulties who could have used help, nieces and nephews a soldier might never meet. The family life that continued without the soldier's participation created a sense of loss that permeated military experience. Soldiers felt that they were missing out on life itself, watching from a distance as the years passed and opportunities for connection and meaning slipped away. The psychological impact of this separation contributed to various problems. Some soldiers became withdrawn or emotionally distant, protecting themselves from feeling the pain of separation by numbing their emotional responses. Others became depressed, struggling with feelings of loss and displacement. Still others acted out through drinking, conflict with other soldiers, or other behaviours that reflected underlying emotional distress. Homecoming after discharge was often complex and difficult. Veterans returning to communities they left decades earlier found that almost everything had changed. Parents might have passed away. Siblings might be strangers with their own established lives. Childhood friends might have moved away or become so different as to be unrecognisable. The home that soldiers remembered and longed for during their service often no longer existed in any meaningful sense. The sense of displacement could be profound. Veterans who had spent 25 years in military life, where every aspect of existence was structured and purposeful, suddenly found themselves in civilian society where they had to establish new identities and purposes. The skills that made someone an effective soldier didn't always translate to civilian success. Many veterans struggled to adjust, finding civilian life bewilderingly unstructured after decades of military discipline. Some veterans never successfully transitioned back to civilian life. They remained emotionally and psychologically in the military world, even after their service ended, seeking out other veterans and living in communities of former soldiers where the military culture persisted. In a sense, the military separation from civilian life became permanent, not because regulations required it, but because the experience of service had changed these men so fundamentally that they could never fully return to the civilian world they'd left behind. And so, as we step back from the marching columns and fortified camps of the Roman legions, a clearer picture emerges of what military service truly meant for the men who built and maintained Rome's empire. These weren't invincible warriors from legend, somehow immune to hardship and fear. They were ordinary men who faced extraordinary challenges, enduring conditions that tested human limits of physical endurance, mental resilience, and emotional strength. Day after day, year after year, for 25 years of their lives, they persisted through difficulties that would overwhelm most modern people. The hardships they faced were cumulative and comprehensive. Physical demands from endless marching under heavy loads created chronic pain and injury that most soldiers carried throughout their lives. Poor nutrition, disease, and limited medical care undermined health in ways that even surviving service couldn't fully erase. Harsh discipline stripped away personal autonomy and freedom, demanding perfect obedience and collective responsibility. Living conditions offered no comfort, no privacy, no escape from the constant presence of others. The separation from family and home created psychological wounds that decades couldn't heal. Yet Roman soldiers persevered through all of this, creating the military force that conquered and held an empire spanning 3 continents. Their perseverance wasn't rooted in superhuman abilities or unique toughness unavailable to other peoples. It came from systematic training that conditioned men to endure, discipline that demanded persistence regardless of circumstances, and unit cohesion that created social bonds stronger than individual suffering. The Roman military system, for all its harshness, successfully transformed ordinary men into soldiers who could and did achieve extraordinary things. Understanding the reality of Roman military service also illuminates why the empire eventually struggled to maintain its armies. The demanding nature of service, the long commitment required, and the hardships involved made recruitment increasingly difficult as time passed. As the empire matured and economic opportunities expanded for Roman citizens, fewer men were willing to surrender 25 years of their lives to military service. The empire had to rely increasingly on recruits from less Romanized provinces, and eventually on allied peoples who served in exchange for various benefits, including eventual citizenship. The veterans who survived their service and received honourable discharge had earned their rest in the most literal sense. 25 years of unrelenting challenge, hardship and danger left men aged beyond their years. Many veterans carried permanent physical damage, damaged joints, chronic back problems, old wounds that never healed properly, missing fingers or toes from frostbite or accidents, dental problems from poor diet and limited care. The discharge bonus and land grant that veterans received represented more than just compensation. They acknowledged that these men had given everything they had in service to Rome. For modern audiences, the Roman military experience offers perspective on several levels. It demonstrates how much hardship human beings can endure when social systems demand and support such endurance. It shows that legendary military success comes at enormous personal cost paid by individual soldiers. It reveals that even advanced civilizations have asked young people to sacrifice prime years of their lives in service to larger collective goals, accepting that individual welfare matters less than state security and expansion. The story of Roman soldiers also humanizes these distant historical figures. Reading about Roman conquests in history books, seeing ruins of Roman military infrastructure across Europe and the Mediterranean, it's easy to think of the legions as abstract forces rather than collections of individual people. Understanding the daily hardships, the constant discomfort, the emotional toll of separation, and the grinding persistence required to survive decades of service reminds us that every Roman victory was built on the endurance of thousands of ordinary men who hurt, who missed their families, who got sick and tired, and who had to find ways to keep going anyway. Perhaps most importantly, recognizing what Roman soldiers endured creates appreciation for the genuine progress in military service conditions over the intervening centuries. Modern military personnel certainly face challenges, risks and hardships that civilians rarely fully appreciate. However, the service terms are measured in years rather than decades. Medical care is vastly superior. Nutrition is adequate. Living conditions offer privacy and comfort unavailable to ancient soldiers, and communication with families is nearly instant rather than taking months. These improvements didn't happen accidentally. They represent hard-won recognition that effective military forces depend on treating personnel with dignity and providing conditions that support rather than undermine health and well-being. The Roman legionaries who marched across continents, who built roads and forts and cities, who fought in countless battles and campaigned for decades, these men deserve recognition not just for their military achievements, but for their sheer human perseverance. They endured what seems almost unendurable. They sacrificed decades of their lives to serve a state that demanded everything from them, and they did so with discipline and effectiveness that still impresses 2,000 years later. The reality of their service was indeed a nightmare by modern standards, yet they lived it, survived it when they could, and left a legacy that shaped the world. Their story is one of hardship endured, sacrifice accepted, and human resilience proven across 25-year journeys that tested everything men could be asked to give. In remembering their struggles, we honour not superhuman heroes but ordinary people who accomplished extraordinary things through persistence, in the face of difficulties almost impossible to imagine from the comfort of contemporary life.